Hey, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the penultimate edition of Forward Maryland. And my name is Bill Woodcock.
And I'm Steve Hunt. Good morning, everybody.
And I almost forgot where the hell I was and who the hell I was this morning. It's one of those damn days. Without any further ado, I'm going to let Steve lead the discussion of this for a little bit. But we are welcoming to the podcast a semi-regular friend of the podcast. Well, he's a regular friend of the podcast and semi-regular guest. In fact, I do believe which this episode, Rich Elliott has gained his 3 appearance smoking jacket. So, Richard Deshay Elliott, everybody, welcome back to the podcast.
Hey, good morning. I'm going to take it off with Steve. I'm going to be excited to talk with you about what's going on in the state, particularly what happened in the last legislative session. And I think the Republican presidential primary, the upcoming potential Democratic presidential primary, there's going to be some topics we're going to go into. Take it away, Steve.
Sounds awesome. All right, Steve, lead it off for us today.
Great. Thank you, Bill, and thank you, Rich, for joining us again. Great to have you on as a guest. Obviously, as we've talked about before, it actually resonates with me because, you're very big in the county of my youth, Prince George's County. So it's always good to have a conversation with you. And I'm sure our fair county will come up over the course of this conversation, especially when we're talking about the gubernatorial race. I'm sorry, gubernatorial race. I'm still in 22, y'all. The Senate race in Maryland in 2024. But Rich, I wanted to ask you something, and this is one of the reasons Bill and I had talked a couple of weeks ago that, we were talking about guests for the final shows, and I said, I want to have Rich on because there's something I want to talk to Rich about. So it's more of a wider issue than some of the specifics we're going to talk about, and it really is the engagement of young people in politics. And obviously, Bill and I, we're old dogs. You're part of the new generation coming up, and it just seems to me like over the last 5, 6, maybe even a few more years, young people, nationwide are really stepping up to the plate and really getting engaged, really getting active politically. I was a child mostly in the 70s. I'd hear stories about the civil rights movement, but I wasn't around for it. But it felt like with young people that seemed to fade in the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, maybe even the 2010s. But recently it's really ramped up, and I feel like it started with the Parkland shooting and the March for Our Lives movement and Students Demand along with Moms Demand, the Pulse nightclubs shooting, which also engaged other marginalized communities into the equation. And then all the way through this year, 2018, the elections in Congress with young people like AOC getting elected. Then you had Black Lives Matter, which I think really took things next level. That really gave a lot of fuel to the eventual election of President Biden. And then even the recent elections where you saw your first Gen Z elected member of Congress in Alejandro Frost out of Florida. And then this year you have, I call them the Justins, 2 members of the Tennessee 3. Basically they tried to expel them. They were the youngest members of the Tennessee legislature, young Black men. And then the young lady, I can't remember her name right now. I was trying to Google it while Bill was talking, in Montana, who got, equally censored, also a relatively young person. But from your take, as a person of your age, are you seeing the same thing that I'm seeing as far as young people really getting in the game in a big way?
So I'm going to take this in a couple of different places. Some of it's going to involve political clubs, but I'll start with, I think the origin of a lot of not necessarily the origin, but the biggest kind of outgrowth of this generation and the preceding generation's activism was really the election and candidacy of Barack Obama. I was in middle school. I never was able to vote for him. Even when he ran for re-election, I was a senior in high school and I was like 17 at the time of the election. So for people slightly older than us, our older siblings, our uncles, our parents, that was really what their biggest outgrowth was, but particularly with the growth of social media and really the need, like the pandemic, I think, and more than anything ever, highlighted the gaps in just American governance and policy for ordinary folks. I think that's energized it much, much more. The Black Lives Matter movement, absolutely. But we have to keep in mind that the protests after the murder of George Floyd were the largest protests in terms of the number of active individuals in American history. That did culminate in the election of Biden, which that's going to be a whole nother topic we get into. So that's where I think a lot of the youth activism has resulted in terms of just voting outreach. There's a whole lot more regarding issue advocacy, whether it be in Flint, whether it be in Baltimore, all over the country, where there's been lots of local activism that in many cases has not gotten national visibility or has not gotten national visibility to the need it deserved. There's also, in my opinion, Howard County being a counterexample, there is almost no political organization, organized political clubs among older people anymore. In Baltimore, at one point, there were a wide variety of political clubs, whether you had the Stonewall Jackson Club, whether you had the wide variety of Black clubs, whether you had the East End Democratic Club, whether you had the East Side Democratic Organization, all of which were based on a variety of things, whether getting jobs, whether getting services, whether highlighting the needs of the community, etc. The 2008 recession really ended those because a lot of their meeting spaces ended up having to be sold. And if you don't have a consistent meeting space, people fall off in membership. I think that the pandemic, with the move to Zoom, even further accelerated that. I think that by things moving to Zoom, there became so much things that became accessible with your time to invest in, that a lot of people have found their things to invest in rather than trying to do, before the pandemic, I would have tried to do a lot more different stuff. Now it's a lot easier to find your particular lane for whether it be advocacy or hobbies, even for what you want to do and focusing on that. And of course, I can't neglect at all the rising cost of living and inflation, to where I think volunteerism is at an all-time low, not because people don't want to volunteer, but because people can't, because the cost even of volunteering is too high. You're muted.
I just saw my little arrow. Thank you, Rich. And by the way, Zoe Zephyr is the representative in Montana. I was able to look her up. I wanted to make sure I gave proper credit for what happened with her, along with Pearson, Jones, and also, God, I forget the lady's name in Tennessee, Gloria Johnson. So I want to make sure she got proper credit. And Rich, you actually got into a couple of things that I was going to drill down further for you. Is what are you seeing in the state of Maryland? Because I know you're very active in Maryland as far as young people getting engaged. You talked about clubs and how they've been impacted by the pandemic, et cetera. But are you seeing the same kind of forward, more engaged, more active movement in terms of your younger millennials, your Gen Zers here in the great state of Maryland?
Absolutely. So there's a solid number of young delegates. Julian Ivey, Delegate Joe Vogel, who's actually running for Congress to replace Congressman Trone, Ashanti Martinez. So we've appointed Jeff Long. So we've appointed or elected several very young delegates who I think generally have supported very progressive agenda. Delegate Ivey, for example, has put forward bills for years on independent dispensaries. Delegate Long this year put in a bill and it actually passed to create an accessory dwelling unit policy task force that'll be very, very helpful in parts of Southern Maryland where it's hard to build housing because of code restriction or because of building restrictions. So there's a lot of younger people who are getting elected. There are also lots of young people who are working on campaigns and in staff. Now, what I see as a potential jam in the future is it's very hard to just maintain living on a lot of the salaries paid by being a staffer, by being a campaign staffer, working in campaigns. So a lot of people that are in my kind of cohort, whether they're, I'd say maybe from ages about 30 to about 23, who are after college, entering to where they're eventually going to want to buy a home, have a family, blah, blah, blah. It's a lot harder to do that unless you actually are elected or unless the space is made in state government for those individuals. One thing I'm going to applaud Governor Moore for right now is I think the idea for the service year, I think that is going to yield huge benefits in the state in the long term because it's going to keep people in the state. A lot of people younger than me, I'd say under my cohort, 22 and younger, don't want to stay in Maryland because they see it as unaffordable, particularly if they don't have a college education.
Thank you, Rich. And you're right. Great point about people getting involved in campaigns. I know for many years, interns, mostly young people, were not paid. I know a certain number of campaigns, even at the presidential level, started paying, their staff volunteers. I think that was a positive move, and hopefully that continues. But we do have our very talented and esteemed host, Mr. Woodcock, back in. So, Bill, I will turn it over to you to ask the next question of Mr. Elliott.
Well, thank you, Steve. And Rich, what you just said in your answer to Steve's first question kind of maybe diverts this entire episode of this podcast, because you said something very interesting about activism within the Democratic Party. Now, I was a more active Democrat, Democratic clubs were more independent, and they're not now. Why do you attribute this, and how do we get that independence back?
See, you're going in a very good direction. So what I'm citing regarding the Baltimore political clubs, in many cases, those were very regional organizations with the goal of getting jobs, whether getting economic development in your community to create jobs or getting city jobs in your district. Those fell off very much so by the 2000s. Now, a lot of the clubs, particularly in Howard County, where the cost of living crisis that I talked about earlier makes it so that there's almost no young people who are involved in who are active in politics, who are not employed in politics, government, or civics. Does that make sense? Particularly in Howard County. In Prince George's, that's less of a circumstance. In Baltimore City, particularly, that's less of a circumstance. But in Howard, that's the most of the case. It's very expensive to live there. There's almost no young people there who are there with long-term housing situations. Most of the young folks there are renting, are going to be there for 2 years, 3 years or less. So the clubs are consisting of short-term individuals who necessarily don't have long-term leadership, or the long-term leadership are people who are elected officials. That was another thing that killed off many of these clubs in Baltimore. Elected officials from the clubs basically didn't need the clubs anymore, so the clubs would fall off. That's the case in reverse now. A lot of the clubs are defined by their relationships with elected officials, by their relationships with people in party leadership. That's not necessarily a negative. However, it defines the relationships of the clubs going forward and makes it very hard to develop a financial base for the clubs independent of elected officials. I'm going to relate this to a point with the Senate race later on.
Well, speaking of which, I think, Bill, unless you have another question there, and by the way, Rich, you've mentioned Howard County and clubs and folks active there. Bill and I certainly could do a whole podcast on that. I think he and I could name in very short order the number of people who are active right now in politics, which that is not a good statement when you can very quickly, name them. So you're absolutely right as far as that's concerned. So, we've talked about, basically political activism and getting involved in campaigns. So figure we may as well jump into the next topic and just get into campaigns. And, Bill had to step back out. So I'm going to start national because I know Bill really wants to get into the more local stuff. So I want to make sure he's around. But, nationally speaking, on the Democratic side, it looks like it's Joe Biden and more Joe Biden. Democrats of any name or stature or anybody you would think, okay, yeah, that person could be the next president. They've all basically stepped aside and have decided not to run. I think you only have two other candidates in Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and Marianne Williamson. On the Republican side, on the other hand, we're going to have ourselves a real rodeo there because, You obviously have Donald Trump in, you have Nikki Haley in, but it looks like Tim Scott's jumping in. Ron DeSantis is talking about jumping in this week. Asa Hutchinson, I believe, is already in.
Yep.
And there are a few other names out there. So, however you want to go about this, Rich, if you want to just hit the Democrats first and then the Republicans, or hit it all in one big, lovely bucket, what are you seeing as far as the initial contours of, election 24 national style, at least the presidential level?
Okay. Disclosure. With this being a very, I'll call this an LBJ 1968 election. I support Joe. I'm all in for Joe. I think that Joe could have done more on pandemic response, but for what his administration did in the first 2 years, where they didn't even have congressional majorities in terms of improving COVID response from the Trump administration, and really presiding over the greatest expansion of the social safety net in American history. I will say that again, the greatest and most inclusive expansion in the social safety net, particularly for Black people, for women, and for young people in American history, happened in the first couple years of Joe Biden's administration. I'm supporting Joe. I love Marianne Williamson. I am a huge fan of hers because she was kind enough during the Carter campaign to come out and endorse us and support us and offer even to fly out and do stuff with us. So I'm not going to denigrate Marianne, but here's my opinion of this. If in the Iowa primaries, if it is truly only those three running and Joe Biden has a low showing, as I believe Lyndon Johnson did in New Hampshire in 1968, to where somebody else chooses to run that is a serious candidate to harness that energy, that would provide a very interesting race. While I said I am all in for Joe, I think that there could be a circumstance where, let's say that Josh Kurtz of Maryland Matters also gave an outstanding analogy with the Robert Fustero. Robert Fustero got like 30% against Kathleen Kennedy Townsend, and he's just a grocery store clerk. If Rob Kennedy Jr. and Marianne are able to get 20%, 25%, which wouldn't be a surprise, in my opinion, in Iowa, where they don't have the caucus system anymore, I don't believe, but it's still caucus style voters who, once you understand, I only go to vote because it's a person I strongly believe in, I think that mentality is going to hold over for decades in Iowa regardless. Now that that's going to be the case, or possibly even with a new state having a first primary where you put a new state, South Carolina having an earlier primary, or Nevada where they still have the caucus process, Joe Biden can have a very interesting primary challenge, even if it's only Rob Kennedy and Marianne Williamson at the gate. If several people choose to jump in because Joe does poorly in opening states, as he did last time, I must add, he has not ever had a base of support in Iowa. He has not ever had a base of support in New Hampshire. He has not ever really had a base of support in Nevada. So those early states, if you look at past performance, not just in 2020, but in 2008 or in 1988, he's always done poorly there. If you put those factors into play, Joe Biden could face an LBJ style late primary wolf attack, where he basically chooses not to run because it's not advantageous. I actually think that would probably be the best circumstance for the party in the long term, regardless of my personal support for Joe.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, and I think it's very clear, and I don't think anybody's made any bones about the fact with the whole calendar switch, putting South Carolina front and center allows Biden to put that in his back pocket, so that even if there is not the result, as you said, he's never done well in Iowa, he's never done well in New Hampshire. The fact that he got within, people were saying, hey, he got within 10 points of Sanders in Nevada, that was a win, but that's still, a double-digit loss, quite frankly. So you're right. I think the move to put Iowa out front and move some of the other states, I think it's the Biden team and the DNC, Jamie Harrison working with them, that attempt to avoid what you're talking about. Because I think if it were the traditional calendar, Iowa, New Hampshire, Nevada, I think that really sets up your scenario exactly. So I think that, you get South Carolina, you maybe have a few bumps with those three, and then you go big in Michigan, and you can say, hey, it's okay. So I think you're absolutely right. That is a scenario that would play out very well. And I'm with you on Biden. I think there's too much emphasis on the failures of the Biden administration. And I don't even say failures. I think it's, to your point, things that didn't go the way even he wanted to because of the makeup of Congress. He wasn't going to get an assault weapons ban through Congress. He wasn't going to get even the watered down version of the John Lewis Voting Rights Act through Congress. He just doesn't have the numbers to get. And those are the two that people really look at is, well, he didn't get voting rights. He didn't get an assault weapons ban. And obviously abortion is becoming an issue. So I'm with you. I think he's done a tremendous job. I think if he were 20 years younger, we wouldn't even be having conversations about Joe Biden.
Let me interject with a very serious point. Joe Biden, if he chose not to run for re-election right now, is a top 5 American president of all time with ease. With ease, he came in when you could argue we were at Civil War levels of tension and presided over the greatest expansion of the social safety net in American history, particularly for Black folks. And I'm not going to say has ended the pandemic, but has gotten the country that has performed the worst on the pandemic in the world to at least mitigating risk and preparing for the future. On those three gigantic shocks, and I'll say again, particularly for the audience listening, has been a better president on policy, not necessarily on cultural impact, not necessarily on historical impact, but has been a better president on policy than Barack Obama, than Bill Clinton, than Jimmy Carter. I would rank him very close with Lyndon Johnson. Very close.
Yeah, and I absolutely agree. I don't think he gets enough love. And the presidents you mentioned, I love them all. I think they were all great people. I mean, you will never get me you try to say something bad about Barack Obama and I'm ready to go. But I think you're right. I mean, facts are facts. It is what it is. So, but I mentioned one last issue, and that being abortion, which seems to be the issue that is driving so much. And we can get back we get to the Republican side in a minute. And I think one of the big problems they have is right now, if I were to rank the issues that are resonating with the voters of the American people right now, I would say abortion, guns, democracy, and democracy has a lot of subsets, voting rights and some other civil rights issues. I don't see them winning any of those. And do you see any of those issues and any of the Republicans running as we pivot? As you know, Rich, in politics, the whole thing you want to find is, what's my winning message? What's my winning formula? I can't find their formula. I can't find their message that gets them out of, maybe through the primary, but not in the general election. Are you seeing something I'm not seeing here?
We've reached, so this is a good transition for the Republican part. In my opinion, the only 2 Republican candidates that are electable in even the slightest for president of the country, I'll say 3, because Hogan's electable nationally. He just would never make it through a primary, obviously, so don't even need to argue on that. Trump and DeSantis are the only 2 that have any possibility, in my opinion, of being elected nationally. Trump just has fans. There's a lot of people who could give a darn about anything political otherwise who love Trump. There's people I know who hold positions even that I like on other stuff, who end up liking Trump for bizarre reasons I find bizarre, but end up liking Trump. So he has fans, much like a football team has fans. This is the best analogy I can use for it, unfortunately. And DeSantis, I think he's going to have such a arsenal of funds. He has, in my opinion, and from what I've read, worked out a way. So in Florida, you can raise unlimited money.
Right.
You can raise unlimited money from corporations and individuals. So I think he had something like $60 million.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's in the bank, collecting interest on the day by day. I think that he's found a workaround to transition all of that money to a federal account, because you can dissociate yourself from your personal account in Florida. You can give it to somebody else, and then they can transfer all of that money to your account, which is a federal account. So
he's worked out several workarounds down in Florida. Being the king has its privileges, even when it came to, I don't have to give up my job to run for president. So he's has created an ecosystem that works for him, and he is working the heck out of it.
Right. And for political economy, this is a conversation we can maybe end the call with, not go to now, is which is a more powerful economic system, the state government of Florida or the National Republican Party? That's a very interesting theory to think on, because whichever one of those is a more powerful political economy entity really might determine that next race, because, obviously the faller outs are going to go with whatever they think is more feasible. If Ron DeSantis even loses as president this time, but remains as governor of Florida, if I'm Tim Scott, if I'm a lot of these other people, I might end up, backing down and supporting DeSantis, specifically because there's parachutes to where I could become how many presidents and universities of Florida are there? How many university presidentships are there? How many boards are there that you can serve on concurrently, where you meet once a year for 10 minutes? To get those kind of things, because that's really what a lot of people are going to look for after the primaries we've seen repeatedly. So to go into the kind of contestation, the Republican primary, I think, is going to be more contested against Trump than people realize. I think that Trump has lost fans specifically because he's not winning. The Patriots only have fans when they're winning, even with the best logo in the sport. We can agree on that. He has not been winning. A lot of the people he has supported for a variety of things have lost, whether it be in a primary, whether it be in a general, or whether it be for partisan control. I think that even Trump's pick for the Maryland Republican Party, I think even they lost. So a lot of his winning streak has worn off badly. I'd say that really started in the 2018 primaries, but in 2022, that's where it, clearly the mark of Trump was just bad.
Yeah.
I think that because so many more Republicans have died of COVID, and there were a lot of close elections, seriously. Across the country, there were a lot of elections that were 1,000 votes, 500 votes, 10 votes. COVID has a real impact when you're talking about that few number of votes. But Trump has also lost a lot of his people who were kind of, you could call them like lieutenants that were in the lower levels of state parties and stuff, the people that would make it easier for him to get delegates. The thing that made Trump win in 2016 in the Republican primary was the winner take all system. If they did the way Democrats do, where you get, this part of the county, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
There would have been a contested convention. Trump probably would have lost narrowly. Would have been a, interesting scenario, but he wouldn't have won outright. Are Republicans going to go with the winner take all system? I don't know. I don't really know their inner workings, but I don't think there's a guarantee of that winner take all system going forward. Is Florida going to advance in the Republican primary? Because right now, if I'm Ron DeSantis, I want Florida to vote second. I want to prove that I have viability in Iowa or wherever, and then I want Florida to go second. I don't want Florida first, but I want Florida second, because you always want to prove viability, prove the front runner is weak. Again, Trump did not do good in Iowa in 2016. So we have a very unique circumstance, maybe in American political history. We have two front runners, neither of whom is strong in Iowa, both of whom are relying on South Carolina in some capacity to get them through, where they're still going to have a strong contest in South Carolina. I'm going to pivot to Maryland from this, but think about what Tim Scott is going to be able to do to hurt Trump in South Carolina, I believe, and help Ron DeSantis. Tim Scott is going to have some residual votes just from people who, I want to make sure that my district is getting enough support down the line. It's going to happen. He'll end up with some support. That's going to hurt Trump, in my opinion, and that's going to help DeSantis. So you could have a Tim Scott candidacy that is boosted by outside spending to hurt Trump and help DeSantis.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. And to your point, Rich, in a private conversation that I guess was released, a donor meeting, DeSantis made a similar point. He said there are three people who can win: me, Trump, and Biden, and Trump ain't it. So he is, that whole losing streak argument is certainly one that DeSantis is making. But I think we have Bill back. I don't know, Bill, if you had anything to add or any questions on the national level before we move closer to home.
I think it's probably time to. Well, Rich, I honestly have to admit, I don't see things the way you do.
Go. I want to hear you.
I'm very interested to understand this entire pathway where anyone other than Donald Trump wins the Republican nomination. The Republicans are doing winner takes all. Your point about who's stronger, the economy of Florida or the economy of the Republican Party, that answer's clear. It's the Republican Party, and it's still Trump's party. Trump's winning by 2-1 in all Republican primary polling. I'm with you. I would love to see anybody other than Donald Trump win the Republican nomination. Even Ron DeSantis, but I just don't see where he has that path. I also don't see the DeSantis campaign as being that much of a well-oiled machine right now, given their inability to differentiate his national message from what's going on in Florida. Plus, there's another issue. Hold on a second, I'm not done. Plus, there's another issue that is very important, and I heard you touch upon it: media complicity. And media complicity wants to see the Biden-Trump rematch. They don't want to see anybody else. So you just put in a very interesting chat comment. I'd love to hear you draw that analogy more and more, because even in that analogy, that person didn't win until in the primary until the next time. But I'll give you the floor, sir.
Okay, so the analogy I put in the chat, I was sorry to interrupt you, but I thought it was a good one. It was a good one. You motivated me to. And yes, exactly. I think that Reagan 1976 is the most apt analogy for Ron DeSantis right now. Reagan had run prior. He ran in 1968. He had some support, got even more support through national speeches, blah, blah, blah. Ran in 1976 basically as just the outsider candidate to the perceived weak front runner. So I'm comparing Donald Trump with Jerry Ford in this case. I actually like that because I would rather Trump be the nominee, because there are, like I said, the Patriots have fans who like him because they're winning. The Patriots have opponents who hate him because they're winning. Trump has people who will vote against him naturally. Whereas there's people who kind of give a shit less, who give a hoot less.
You're fine. We threw that out.
Okay. So
say whatever you want. This is the next to last episode. Go for it.
So again, for the Reagan 76 argument, a lot of national conservative entities building for the future invested in him in that election. He did lose, but he had a convention fight where he basically came a vice presidential nomination. He chose the wrong person. He chose a moderate to try and balance the ticket instead of a conservative to unite the ticket, and the conservatives bolted and they went to Ford because Ford just seemed more of a winning candidate. I could see in this election where DeSantis probably does pretty poorly in every state outside of, the caucus states and Florida. Maybe has some appeal in some of the other parts of the South, maybe. But basically just is able to amalgamate money, start to build name recognition. And by running against Trump, you're able to look like a moderate. It's the opposite effect of Reagan, ironically, even though I think DeSantis is actually more of a danger, I guess. I'm not going to say conservative. He's more of a danger because he clearly knows how to work the wheels every which way.
Yeah.
Trump can't work the wheels any which way.
Right. I agree with you on a ton of your points. I mean, I believe that this is the last stand for Trumpism. I think a lot of the primary results you see in general election results, it speaks to the fact that there are two Americas having this election, right? There are the uncontested states, either red or blue, or there are the contested states, the purple states, the 10 or 12 states that go within 2 or 3 points either way. And I think what you see is where the Trump brand has a lot more success in those uncontested states, even the blue ones. Witness what happened with our own gubernatorial primary, but a lot less success in the contested states, especially when it gets to time to for a general election. But I mean, you could look even to this past week with the Kentucky gubernatorial race, although I'll also say that Trump doesn't get 100% of the credit for that, because the gentleman who won is also Mitch McConnell's son-in-law. So, but he's also happens to be the Trump-backed person. So while we're on the subject of states, I know Steve and I have been kind of impressed and also really, really weirded out, for want of a better term, about how the Democratic field for the U.S. Senate seat has not just formed, but firmed up. I mean, last week we saw Johnny O bow out in order to endorse County Executive Also Brooks. I think the only prominent name we haven't heard from yet in the Senate race is Jamie Raskin. Give us your thoughts on the state of this, the early state of play of the Maryland Senate race to replace Ben Cardin.
All right, so disclosure, because I cover this, I'm not going to say my opinion of who I'm supporting,
Sure.
Although I will have an outstanding article for you very soon about the rally that Angela Alsobrooks held to announce her event. So in the race, I see it essentially as David Trone is going to try to build a sort of Francho-like network, sort of. It's going to be an amalgamation of a lot of outsiders, a lot of people who generally don't have that much in common or would not interact with each other, a lot of opponents of Also Brooks. He's going to amalgamate a lot of those people as, I think, a very powerful entity. I think that Trone right now has incredible name recognition across particularly Montgomery County and Western Maryland, but that name recognition only gets him to about a third of the vote in a contested primary for Congress. So let's put him at about 50% of the vote, roughly, in the Senate primary covering Montgomery County and Western Maryland, just to be charitable. Let's put him at getting roughly 50% of the vote there. That means that he still needs to get probably at least a third of the vote in the Baltimore metro region, in the Prince George's and Southern Maryland, and you probably need to win Eastern Maryland, Eastern Shore with a good amount of votes. That possibility does exist. If David Trone were to put together a network, for example, of a lot of the municipal officials in Prince George's County who don't support County Executive Also Brooks, try to build network in Southern Maryland, it's deep red. There's not really elected officials in most parts, or Democratic elected officials. So there you probably have to partner with a lot of like the organizations who you can just like donate to them and ask them to help pass out your stuff. On the Eastern Shore, again, it's deep red, not many electeds. You probably have to partner with organizations like NAACPs, Chamber of Commerce type entities. In the Baltimore metro region is where it gets very interesting for Trone. I'm not sure what his play is there. Trone is probably going to have to work very hard with the Jewish community, both the Orthodox community inside and outside the city, but particularly the Reform Jewish community in the east side of Baltimore County. And he needs to get known by the Black community in West Baltimore County immediately. That is really his play. If Trone is able to really build the bridge with the Black community in West Baltimore County, and I think in the city, this is an opinion for how Baltimore City voters view Prince George's elected officials. We show up way too late. We throw up a bunch of signs. We don't make any connection with the people there, and we have no understanding of the issues there beyond there's crime. That is how, when I was in Baltimore City, many of the people there, when I told them I'm from Prince George's, I'm from Bowie, and I would ask them, like, what do you think about Baker's gubernatorial or about, whatever campaign? They do not respond in Baltimore to signs because there has been long-term political organization there, Black political organization, for darn near 100 years. People expect to know who you are. So Trone has a pathway for victory, but it's basically he needs to get into West Baltimore County, West Baltimore City, South Baltimore City immediately. Angela Alsobrooks has a different playbook. She is trying to build the establishment playbook that won for Westmore. Her playbook is let everybody know I'm going to win. I have the money. I have the connections. I have the experience. I'm going to win. You want to get on board, because if you're not on board, you're going to get left behind.
Steve, we have about 15 minutes left, but I want to give you a chance, especially since you've done an awesome job substituting or spelling me for a bit with this one. I want to give you a chance to weigh in on what Rich said. I think he brings up a lot of great points.
I think he does as well, Bill. Thank you. I have it just kind of game planning this out in my head. I could see a scenario in a Trone also Brooks type of race. I want to mention some other names in a moment, but if you're talking Trone's also Brooks, I could see a scenario where Trone wins more counties in the state of Maryland and still loses because the counties he loses are Prince George's County, St. Charles County, Howard County, Anne Arundel County. So, I see also Brooks having the advantage, as Rich laid out perfectly, as far as, the areas, Eastern Shore, Western Maryland, deep Southern Maryland, which are deep red anyway. There ain't a whole lot of votes on the Democratic primary side of the House. So I've already in my head thought, hey, Trone could win more counties and still lose the thing. So that was the one thought that I had, and the thing that Rich said that struck with me. But I know, Rich, you teased an article you're going to write about the Also Brooks campaign. I wanted to get your thoughts on what is some of the chatter down there in Prince George's County, because Also Brooks's record has not been perfect as county executive. There's some of the school board stuff. There's some other things going on. So as much as you want to reveal outside of your article, what is the chatter in the county about their county executive, another county executive, of course, because you mentioned the chat, Paris Glendenning has also done it out of PG County, of their county executive running. And then dovetailing off of what we talked about earlier with young people getting engaged and involved, your thoughts on Will Jawando, the delegate out of Montgomery County running.
I'm going to start with Will Jawando, and then I'll go to the Also Brooks part. Will Jawando is a major figure in this election. I personally do not anticipate that he will win. I think that he's going to raise a very serious amount of money. He's going to start to build some name recognition, because there are a large number of voters who are, whether it's because they're a reform voter, whether it's because they're dissatisfied with County Executive Also Brooks, whether it's because they don't like an oligarch buying an election, whether it's because, they have particular policy preferences. Will Jawando is getting a very serious eye from in Howard County, for example, you all's homeboy, Jake Burdett, my good friend. He is considering supporting Will Jawando, specifically because he does not find appeal in Also Brooks and Trone as candidates. Now, of course, I'm going to put that on the back burner for one moment to say that Jamie Raskin is the 800-pound gorilla in the room. If Jamie Raskin says, "I'm back," like Michael Jordan, the race is almost over.
I agree.
Because he destroys Trone's vote. He beat Trone, with Trone outspending him, 7-1, 8-1, back when Jamie was just a state senator. Nobody knows who state senators are. Nobody knows who state senators are. He beat Trone with his millions as a state senator. He's probably more popular than Trone in Trone's existing congressional district. He's probably more popular than Sarbanes in Sarbanes' congressional district. He's probably more popular than Ruppersberger in Ruppersberger's district. He's probably more well-known and liked than Ivy in his congressional district. And he's probably not rated far behind Steny back home. If you can run those numbers, you're kind of a governor front runner,
Right.
So Steny eliminates Trone. He holds quite a bit of sway from the anti-Also Brooks crowd in Prince George's. I can't say where my vote goes, but among Jawando voters, he basically makes Jawando run for Congress and be a very strong contender in District 8, who has a head lead. And hell, even on the Eastern Shore, I would dare to say that Raskin is probably the best known and liked congressman in the state. I would probably say that among Democrats. Right. So if Raskin is number 1 or number 2 in every district in the state, including the black districts, in District 7, maybe he's not number 2. but we're getting into fuzzy numbers there. If you're number
Right.
one, number two, and 7 out of 8, including the deep red Republican district where you might run 80% of the vote, you eliminate Trones Avenue in Eastern Maryland and Western Maryland. You eliminate Juwando's Lane, and you probably make a lot of Annapolis and a lot of Montgomery County folks not want to support Angela Alsobrooks, which limits her money raising capacity. You kind of have the Death Star.
You just raised a very interesting point, Rich. I'm going to ask a very obscure question before we round the turn and head down the stretch. Because you just mentioned the congressional district that not a lot of us think about in the political world in Maryland, which is District 7.
Mm-hmm.
And could there be and I know that there is at least one very prominent future candidate for the District 7 spot waiting in the wings in Howard County.
Oh, yeah.
And that would be our county executive.
Mm-hmm.
And, there are some others who are kind of waiting in the wings. Do you see somebody who maybe is a little more in need of name recognition and maybe jump the line? And I'm thinking about somebody like a Mary Washington, who may put their name into the U.S. Senate race in order to do what you're suggesting Will Juwando might be doing for District 8, and maybe he might be doing it indirectly, but your logic about Raskin moving into the Senate, Juwando moving into Congress is very bad. And of course, as you mentioned earlier, federal dollars and state dollars are campaign coffers, go into different pots. Do you see a potential West Baltimore candidate or Western Baltimore County or even Howard County candidate use this as a testing ground in order to get their name recognition up for an eventual Mfume retirement?
Okay. Love the question. I think no, and here's why. The Baltimore mayor's race is as open as it has ever been.
Very good point.
Brandon Scott he's sub 30%. So he won with about 29%. So he won his last election. It was very contested with 29%. He's slightly edged over Sheila Dixon. In my opinion, Sheila Dixon lost primarily because Jack Young did not officially back out of the race, even though he effectively stopped running. If Jack Young had officially dropped out of the race or even said, I would love for Sheila to win, Sheila Dixon would have won mayor. So Brandon Scott is exceptionally weak as a mayoral reelection candidate. I would dare to even say he's weaker than Jack Young was at this exact moment. Jack Young just, he got into the race at the absolute last minute because he was appointed. Because Brandon Scott is very weak as a mayoral candidate, if I were any of those any of the Baltimore senators or delegates or, person that had any interest in that, I would run for mayor. Because right now I feel that you could run for mayor and almost nobody could really be mad at you because anything could happen in the race. Anything could happen. I would not be surprised to see a 10-candidate race as there was in actually most of the Baltimore mayor's races since they changed the primary have been like a ton of candidate affairs. But I heard that Sheila Dixon is running for mayor. I don't cover Baltimore right now. Madam Mayor, I love you. Please come back. You're the best mayor that Black Baltimore ever had. And I don't want you to be the best mayor that Black Baltimore ever had in the past. You're due for a comeback. I believe that Catherine Pugh may run for mayor. What people don't know, Catherine Pugh has $600,000, I believe, still in her campaign account. I believe as part of her plea deal. I'm not sure of it, but I'm pretty sure that she has $600,000 still in her campaign account as part of her plea deal, because that wasn't her money. That was technically her treasurer's money. I think you were able to plead out or something like that. I'm not a lawyer. So that money exists. And while that money's not enough to run for mayor and win, that brings several questions into ponderance. Number one, Catherine Pugh won as mayor with white votes. Does Catherine Pugh have a redemption arc with Black voters? Does she lose almost all of her white votes? Does she basically end up becoming a miniature version of Sheila Dixon, basically, then? Second question, do people think worse of Sheila because Catherine is running, or do they think better of Sheila? Sheila was basically extorted into taking gift cards. Catherine Pugh stole almost $1 million with fake, very bad books. Very bad books. I have to say on the record, those are some of the worst books ever published. Hold on, I got a copy.
Thank God. Well, thank God you said that. I mean, have you read mine yet?
Hold on, I got a copy
on Amazon.
I have a copy somewhere in the archives over here. You see, there's a lot.
Do you actually have the healthy whatever?
Here, you all talk for a second. I'm gonna put the video off. I'm gonna find a copy because mine is probably the most valuable one in history. Mine is.
You might have the only one.
No,
you might have the only one that didn't get consigned to destruction.
Hey,
what were those called? Healthy Harriet?
There it is. Wait a minute.
Healthy Holly. There we go. He's got a healthy Holly.
Hold on. With signatures.
Vegetables are green. Yes, they are. Except when they're not.
He's got autographs, bro.
With signatures.
This is crazy. This is like you know
signatures.
Those people who are addicted to like what serial killers do, Steve. This is like Rich. He's addicted to these politicians with issues.
Oh boy,
that's hardcore, Rich.
I tell you, Bill, we've been talking lately, and we've agreed that our closing speed is pretty next level. But Rich breaking out the book autographed is gonna be a moment, man.
It just went into trans warp drive. It really did. I don't understand what we could do next Tuesday to top any of this mess today. And it's been so much mess. Those of you in viewer and listener land, you have no freaking idea how much mess it's been.
Yeah.
But Steve has done a wonderful job. What else do you have there in your collection, Rich? A Rob Blagojevich signed baseball? Perhaps something from the days of Abscam? Perhaps a Wilbur Mills signed check to a call girl?
Something with the Cuomo, with the signature of the Cuomo brothers.
I got my
book. A wedding invitation for the wedding of John and Rita Jenrette.
You know whose license plate that is?
Sir?
Adam Clayton Powell's license plate.
Oh my word! There we go.
Actually,
where was Eric Cantor's autobiography? Do you have that?
Here's the closer. Steny Hoyer's license plate when he was in the state senate.
Oh wow! You should have where Steny Hoyer sold the Young Democrats of Maryland down the river and made the organization support the Vietnam War way back when. There should be some record of that somewhere. You need a copy of that.
That would be a very interesting future article. I think one of the things I could say in closing to tell people about what I write for the Washington Informer, one of the largest Black-owned papers in the area. I'm covering local politics. There's going to be quite a bit about the Senate race. I also should very soon be submitting articles to Baynet, who covers Southern Maryland news online. So I think that covering that would be very interesting for Baynet as just kind of, voice of the community, because I would have no clue about that. Will or Bill?
No, that's awesome. So I was going to ask you in closing, what are you doing right now? So tell everyone out there in viewer and listener land how they can catch up with you, and how they can, if they like what they've heard today, and I certainly hope they do, how can they see more of you?
Well, I'm hoping that you put together another podcast series in the future to host me, because I think that you all have a very unique and very awesome perspective on Howard County, which is a very weird microcosm of our state. The title of the book I'll eventually do on our state is going to be called The Last Autocrats, about how mayors and executives can very easily consolidate power.
I absolutely love that.
Yeah.
Rich, I will tell you, I think we first had you, Jason and I first had you on the podcast about 2 years ago or so, not long after he and I started doing it in 2019, 2020. 2019, I think it still was. And I will tell you, your growth and development as not just a political activist, but a political thinker is amazing in such a short amount of time. And I'm very glad to know that you are supporting African American publications and initiatives for media outreach. God knows there certainly are not enough of them, media outlets in general, but certainly ones towards the African American community in specific. And, I appreciate what you said about doing another podcast. Never say never. Steve and I have to talk about that. But at the very least, speaking as one of the 50 somethings who do this thing, we know that there's a next generation who's holding leadership accountable and letting them know that they're watching, and people, and that's in good hands. And you are a leading light in that, sir. So I appreciate everything you're doing, and certainly keep it up. Steve?
No, Rich, we appreciate you always as a friend of the podcast, as a guest of the podcast. My first one with you was when we did a top 10, which was awesome. This was even better. The autographed book is going to resonate with me for a while, sir. So, and as I said at the front of the show, the reason I wanted to have you on was to talk about who's next and what's next. As Bill and I, we pulled back from this thing, and we really do want to turn the mic over and the cameras over to the next generation of leaders in the state of Maryland, and in some cases beyond, because I know your advocacy and your activism goes beyond our borders. You're definitely one of them, and I absolutely wanted to have you on the show, so I appreciate you making the time. But before we close, Rich, any last things from you, sir?
Yes, I have an idea of what us three, and particularly the Howard County, could do for the future. There's a outlet called the Northwest Village Voice, run by a gentleman named Kenny Brown. They cover Northwest Baltimore County. I think that Northwest Baltimore County is a perfect bridge to get something into Howard County, because Howard County's lack of the fact that almost government subsidized blogs equals journalism is sick. I'll put it that way. We don't have to say anything further.
You will get no disagreement from either of us, sir. Say no more. We don't need to say further.
And last pitch, important book about the first black woman senator, or the second black woman senator, excuse me, Victorine Adams, West Baltimore legend.
Nice.
Outstanding. Rich, if you don't mind staying on for a minute or two so we can chat, that would be great.
Of course.
Steve?
You're about to open a museum, I imagine.
We start with your
Who
books.
knows what we might do? Now that we know that Disney is closing down that Galactic Star Cruiser hotel, and since Disney is a big enemy of DeSantis, who knows? Steve and I may get interested in the hospitality industry in the Orlando, Florida region. We might launch the Forward Maryland Hotel with only 24 rooms, one for each jurisdiction. Steve, anything listener. You got?
Or for each listener at this point, who knows?
Well, 52 subscribers, Steve, and we were getting made fun of when we only had 22. All those other blogs, the corporate blogs and the corporate podcasts who Rich talks about, they have just as many. Although I understand one's coming back with a vengeance.
Don't call it a comeback.
They've been here for years. Rich doesn't know LL Cool J, Steve.
Oh, I'm sure he knows the.
Yes, he does. Yes, he does.
Yes, I do.
Anyway, Steve, any closing comments?
How else can I top what we've just went through?
We can't. Healthy Holly, Stenny's license plate. It's a lot. So our next edition of Forward Maryland will be our last. It will be the ultimate edition. It will be coming to you Tuesday, the 30th of May, from an undisclosed location, which will be located in Annapolis, Maryland. Will we be at Chicken Ruth's Deli? Will we be neck deep in the Severn River? Will we be standing in a graveyard? Will we be listening to a concert at Ram's Head Live? Will we be at Third Eye Comics? Who the freak knows? We don't even know. So, but it will mark the one and only occasion where Steve and I will be actually co-located to do this podcast. And as I said last week, it shows. So thank you, Steve, for leading off. I wound up having a very weird set of circumstances hit at literally 10 o'clock this morning. Rich, thank you for your flexibility. And my God, sir, always a pleasure to talk with you. And after the 30th, and after we give it a little bit of time to simmer, let's have that other conversation that you just mentioned at the end. I'd be interested in having that talk.
Absolutely. All right, we're signing off. Y'all only get one more of these.
So for Bill and Rich, or for Rich and Steve, I'm Bill. You've been watching or listening to Forward Maryland. Please feel free to stay on a little bit, guys. Have a great day, everybody. Take care.